Starting. Right, Emma,
There you
I don't know if you want the camera on.
Oh, how should I do this?
Do you want it just on?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Hello.
Yeah, I'll be
Thank
fine.
you.
So, hi everyone, just briefly so that you can see my face. I'm Eleanor, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And as just said, essentially what I'm going to be doing this afternoon is taking you on a brief tour of my book, which will be out in, well, I think it's January in the States and March here is the answer. So we're going to talk a little bit about gender in the medieval period and now, and actually indeed as a part of this, we also have to talk about gender in the ancient period, as you'll see. So, okay, I'll turn this off now. There we go. So we can focus on the slides a little bit. And you know, as I say, we will get to questions at the end. So please do let me know. So yes, essentially, if you're going to start talking about gender in the medieval period, you can't do it without talking about the ancient period, and this is because of what the medieval period is and how it functions, right? So if we understand the Middle Ages to literally be the Middle Ages, so somewhere between the ancient world and the modern world, it's impossible to not talk about the ancient world, which is the terrible thing about being a medieval historian, because you have to know everything, and it's very tiring for me. But some of the big places that medieval people in particular get their ideas about gender are classical philosophers. And they have some really interesting ways of thinking about gender and particularly women. So Plato, when he talks about the creation of gender, he talks about more specifically the creation of women. And this he does in his Timaeus. And when he's first kind of puts forth this idea, it is a theory of creation, like a creation myth. And it's actually how he talks about the creation of Eros. So Plato's idea here is that at the beginning of the world, the gods created men. And that's who existed. All of the people were men. And the physical world was meant to be understood as a sort of moral proving ground. So as one went through one's life, you attempted to be the best version of a man that one could be. And when you died, if you did well, then you went into the afterlife. And if you didn't do well, you were then reincarnated as a woman. So all the women on Earth are sort of failed men. They're kind of like men who didn't really make the grade, and that's why they've come back. And now Plato says that when women first appeared on the earth, men then reacted to that and had a kind of stirring within their brains that went down their spinal cord, which is sort of the ancient way of thinking about semen. So the ancient and medieval conception is that semen is created in the brain, moves down the spinal cord, and then into the generative organs and out of them. So that is happening as a result of semen's desire to leave the male body, because semen is seen as having a mind of its own. And that the friction that it causes within men's bodies is therefore Eros. So you can see what's kind of happening here is that to Plato's way of thinking, there is kind of only one gender, which is women. Right? Because the default person is a man. Men were the thing that was created first. And so then if you're going to be bringing gender into it, it's because a woman showed up. And then now suddenly, oh, you've got gender instead of just having people. And then again, more particularly, that also specifically is linked to conceptions of sexuality, conceptions of lust. These are the sort of things that are created in relationship to women. Now, Aristotle doesn't like pick up Plato's way of thinking about this whole cloth, but he does write rather a lot about women in a similar circumstance. And to Aristotle's way of thinking, yes, so again, men are default humans. Okay, so a man is what a human ideally would be, unless something goes wrong in sort of the process of humans incubating. In which case, then, something happens to the embryo and then it becomes a woman. Of course, this is the exact opposite of what happens, but hey-ho. So according to Aristotle, then, women are kind of like a sort of deformed man, or more particularly, he often says that women are inside-out men. And so you can understand that because, for example, women's generative organs are internal, whereas men's are external. So if you just kind of like took a man and then kind of pulled him inside out, then everything kind of goes in. And this isn't actually too far off of the case. We do know that genital organs, for the most part, are sort of like made out of all exactly the same tissues. And, you know, sure, you know, for a bunch of people who don't have a way of doing dissection legally, that's not so bad. We'll take it, right? But it's more than that for Aristotle, right? And just like with Plato, there's this thing where it's like women are kind of like a failed man. For Aristotle, it's not just that women's bodies are an inversion of men, it's also kind of their personality and the way that they think about things. So he says here that women are more mischievous, less simple, more impulsive, more compassionate, more easily moved to tears, more jealous, more querulous, more apt to scold and strike, more prone to despondency and less hopeful, more void of shame and self-respect, more false of speech, more deceptive, of more retentive memory, more wakeful, more shrinking, and more difficult to rouse to action than are men. So this is quite a funny list of things, because some of these things, you know, you would think that they are good, but I love this kind of like of more retentive memory, and as being kind of like, your wife remembers everything wrong, isn't it? You know, that's every little thing you've ever done. So he's kind of got these, you know, it's hilarious because it kind of like reminds me of 70s comedians or something like that. But within this, you see kind of like a lot of things that we would expect to see kind of lobbied at women. So women being, you know, more compassionate. Sure, that's something that we would expect to see from a gendered thing. Although it's quite interesting here how he hits on more querulous, right? Less simple, right? So it's this idea that men are very straightforward, you know, and you always know what's going on with them, but women are unknowable, right? Women are this big, complex mess of things that you're never going to entirely understand. But also kind of within this, as you can sort of see, one of the things that he's also kind of getting at here is that women are kind of illogical, right? Women are querulous and they're despondent, and they kind of they just sort of react to circumstances. And a big part of the reason that they react to these circumstances is because they're particularly emotional and emotive. So for Aristotle, one of the big problems with women is just this sort of irrationality. So men are meant to, you know, so it would be one thing to just like say all these things, kind of throw it out there. Well, you know, well, women are more querulent. Fine. You know, like on the face of it, that isn't necessarily an issue. But when Aristotle talks about these things, he's doing so in the context of saying, and as a result, society should be ordered in such a way that men control it all and women are not involved, essentially, because women cannot be expected to control society or partake in society in a particularized way, because of this complexity, this irrationality, and the way that they relate to things. But I'll also draw to your attention here how he says specifically that women have less self-respect and are more void of shame. And this will come up repeatedly, both in kind of the ancient and medieval context. And it's interesting for our purposes, because that's not really how we think of women now. Like we tend to think of women as being particularly cautious about the way that people see them, or being very, very guarded. And so, you know, whereas men are kind of seen as being a little bit more impulsive. So it's interesting to just kind of note that here. That isn't something that you necessarily see across the board. All of which brings us to kind of the next step, right? So when you are talking about medieval philosophy, it is kind of like what I always say, it's a little bit like improvisation, where what they've done is they say yes and, right? So medieval people wholeheartedly love classical philosophy, classical ways of looking at the world, and they absolutely believe these things to be certain, and they base kind of everything off of them. However, the and is obviously Christianity, right? So you take all of, you know, your Socrates, your Aristotle, your Plato, which medieval people absolutely love, and then you slam on some Christianity to the top. So in particular, what's interesting for us to think about in these cases are St. Augustine and St. Jerome. And these are two who we refer to as the Church Fathers. Just a moment. And the Church Fathers are responsible for writing a lot of theological doctrine when Christianity is still forming. Sorry, I have to cough. I have that cold everyone has. It's not COVID. I'm embarrassed. Sorry, everyone. together in the end. Sorry, everyone. What a nuisance. Okay. So these are the people who created the doctrine of Christianity when one doesn't really exist. Right, so the religion exists, but there as yet isn't a real way of thinking about it systemically. So into this comes St. Augustine and St. Jerome. And they have rather less to say about gender, very interestingly. And St. Augustine is interesting because of how he comes by it, because he was rather a rambunctious youth. For years upon years, he has things like a concubine, all these things that you wouldn't think are particularly Christian. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. But when he then eventually comes to Christianity, he gets rid of all that and he devotes himself to Christ, and he's suddenly very much on to the idea that an ideal Christian is a virgin. Okay. And so as a result of this, ideally, in an ideal world, sex would have existed. And he talks about this in terms of how the Garden of Eden works. So the church fathers agree with Aristotle and Plato in that, again, the default man is a man, right? That's Adam. God created Adam, and that's the first human. And Eve is therefore kind of an afterthought. She's like the second. So, and she's made out of Adam's rib, and so Adam is the image of God, because that's how God makes Adam. And Eve is like, yeah, and then something else, and is made like more particularly to serve Adam. And now, within the creation myth, you then get this kind of gendering and this idea about sexuality, because what St. Augustine says is that if Eve had never eaten from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, as she's seen doing here, then lust never would have existed. Okay, so this is rather like Plato's idea of Eros coming into the world with the creation of women. And this isn't to say that sex wouldn't have existed if the fall of man hadn't happened. What Augustine argues is that if the fall of man hadn't happened, what would happen when people wanted to procreate is they would just go, oh, shall we procreate? Oh, yeah, sounds great. And then like everybody's genital organs would work in the way that they would. You just get in there and it would be the same thing as kind of like shaking hands. And you wouldn't feel anything sexual about it. You wouldn't feel lustful about it. It would just be another thing that someone did. And then bada bing, bada boom, baby, essentially. So sex would exist, but the original sin is what makes lust exist, which is a torment to humans. And it's a torment to humans because, again, the ideal human is never going to have sex. So they're going to be a virgin, and they're going to kind of like always pay attention to God, and they're going to put aside all these worldly things. Jerome also kind of picks up on this, and he is he writes a really interesting text called Against Jovinian. Unfortunately, we don't know anything about Jovinian except that St. Jerome got really mad at him and writes this big text, where essentially Jerome was saying that, you know, it doesn't kind of really matter whether you're a married person and you have sex or if you are a virgin. And Jerome is like, absolutely not. By the way, you should be a virgin, and these things are bad. And then the ideal human being is not interested in sexuality, and they can kind of put these things aside. They will be like me, St. Jerome, and they will go out to the desert and beat themselves with rocks every time they become lustful, right? So these two things together add up to the idea that women in particular are lustful, right? Because the ideal human, who is a man, who was created by God, isn't interested in sex. They're interested in religion, right? So women, by virtue of being the ones who brought original sin into the world, are the ones who are interested in sexuality. They're interested in sex. They're very, very lustful. And more to the point, all those things that Plato and Aristotle were saying about women being irrational, women being really led by their emotions, means that they irrationally turn their backs on the right way of living. And they think about sex all the time. So for both St. Augustine and St. Jerome, women are this kind of like irrational, oversexed group of individuals. And the way that you deal with it is, I mean, in an ideal world, like St. Jerome, you start a weird kind of cult with a bunch of women and you take them all to the Holy Land and they like leave their kids behind. It's very strange. But you know, failing that, you then marry them. right? And this is where the saying, "it is better to marry than to burn," comes from. And this means two varying things. The first is that the idea being that, well, if you can't stop yourself from having sex, then it's better to get married instead of burn in the eternal fire of hell for having sex in the wrong way. And then also on top of that, there's this idea that, well, if you can't get your mind off lust, it's better to have sex in the correct way, have children, have a family, have this procreative, acceptable sex, and then that will kind of get rid of this overwhelming lustfulness that you're feeling all the time. But more particularly, that lustfulness is again pinned to women and thought of as a feminine trait. All of which then brings us into the medieval world, right? And to medieval scholasticism more particularly. So we have to understand that medieval people very much see themselves as in this same tradition as Aristotle, as Plato, as Augustine and Jerome, and they are writing about these people all the time. We start to see a big uptake in texts being created, particularly in what we call the Carolingian Renaissance. So this is kind of like when things start kicking off again after everything kind of calms down after the post-Roman period. So round about the late 8th century, 9th century. And this is kind of like the bloom of monastic learning. So for monks, the way that they kind of think about learning and approach learning is that monks will leave the world. Is the idea, and that's what a monastery is for. A monastery is a place apart from the rest of the world where you can devote yourself to God, and so praying and working, or what they call ora et labore, right? And a big part of that labor, yes, is keeping the monastery going. So someone's got to work in the garden, right? Somebody has to be doing the baking, things like that. But also what monasteries have is libraries. And a big part of the work that they do all the time is copying out texts. And so around about this time, you have a specific interest in beginning to copy more and more classical texts, getting these same things in front of everyone, getting this Aristotle out, getting this Plato out, and also, working with the church fathers. So you have lots of monks who are devoted entirely just to writing these books all the time. Now, when Charlemagne comes along, kind of in the 8th century, he's really into this. And that is because Charlemagne, of course, he says that he is like the first new Roman emperor that anyone's seen for quite some time. So good for him. And as a result of that, he wants to be seen as doing imperial classical Roman things, right? And so a big part of him for that is kind of getting knowledge out and expressing these things. So you see a real boom suddenly because Charlemagne specifically funds monasteries. He moves scholars all around Europe. So, for example, his personal secretary is Alcuin, who comes from York, right? And he's like, he will take guys from everywhere, move them around, and get also these particular classical texts moving and send them places where they aren't before. So, he will contact monasteries and they'll say, do you have these particular texts? If they say no, they're like, oh, okay, well, here you go. And they start handing them out. So you have this proliferation of these same ideas we've just been talking about. Then kind of around about the 11th century, we have the rise of what we call the cathedral schools. And this is linked more particularly to the rise of cities in Europe. Cities, they're back in the 11th century. And in order to be a city, you have to have a cathedral. That's how it works. You're not a city without a cathedral. You've got to have, it's like 5 out of 8 things that make a city. And it's like you've got to have city walls. You have to have a cathedral, you have to have a mixed commerce, you have to have things of this nature, right? So you're not a city unless you've got a cathedral. And what cathedrals pledge to do is education. So in theory, any kid, when I say kid, any boy who shows up at a cathedral school will be given a free education. And that's just it. So in practice, this is actually quite limiting, right? Because a lot of families in the medieval world can't afford to give up their kid every day to go to school. 70% of the European population are unfree peasants at this time. They're serfs. 80% of the population in total are peasants. And peasant kids are working on the farm. That's what's happening right now. If you live in a city, more likely that you're going to get sent to the cathedral school, especially because if you live in a city, your parents are probably in a trade or something like that, and you need to kind of learn how to read and write and do maths and that sort of thing in order to help with the business in the long run. So you might get sent down to the cathedral school. And then other people who get sent to the cathedral school are like sons of the nobility, things like that. So if you've got, especially if you've got kind of like a second or third son and he's not going to inherit, then you send them off to the cathedral school so that they can learn a lot and take up ranks in the upper range of the church. So be a bishop, something like that, right? So you go along off to cathedral school. What do cathedral schools teach? Exactly the same thing, right? Exactly the same thing. So they are still obsessed with Aristotle. They're obsessed with the Bible. They're obsessed with St. Jerome and St. Augustine. All the same stuff. All of which takes us to the 12th century and the rise of the university. And this is where, interestingly, the way that universities sprung up, it's really different in various places. So the first one, which starts in Bologna, was started because students wanted it. So the students kind of clubbed together and they started bringing in what they considered to be better teachers to teach more classes. In Paris, it's more the church that does it. They specifically say, well, we are kind of like sponsoring a number of teachers within Paris, and that's the second big university. And then places like here in England, Oxford is started by the king because he doesn't want those Parisians getting ahead of themselves. So he's like, we've got a university too, right? And so this is kind of like the way they are. Universities then are not like universities now. They are kind of like a loose amalgamation of teachers that will teach it, basically wherever they can. And what they teach is the 7 liberal arts, which is personified here by these women in this picture. And within the 7 liberal arts, you have the trivium through the first 3 women who are logic, grammar, and rhetoric. So you see logic's got this book on her head, and then grammar's holding one open, and rhetoric is kind of like getting ready to say something. When we say that, grammar specifically is Latin. You're learning to read and write in Latin. The logic is philosophy. So again, guess what you're reading? It's Aristotle. They also do stuff like that. They read a lot of Cicero. They really like the way that Cicero disputes, things like that. So classical disputation methods are what's taught, and then rhetoric is basically they argue all the time. It's very argument based. You've got like teachers running in and out of each other's calls and calling each other stupid. It's like it's quite interesting. It's a lot more full contact than universities are now, but that's kind of what's going on. If you finish from the trivium, you then move on to the quadrivium, who are the ladies at the back here, and that is music, astronomy, arithmetic, and geometry. And so those are kind of like the more mathy based things. And if you do all 7, that's what makes you a doctor. And that's how you get your PhD. So if you just do the first 3, then you've got your bachelor's, and then it's doctorate after that. And that's basically the forms of learning that are available in the medieval world. So the way to kind of think about these things is that, as Gilbert of Lens says, the way that scholastics in the medieval period think of themselves is as standing on the shoulders of giants. Right. So they can see further than Aristotle or Plato or Cicero could, because they have the benefit of time and they realize that Christianity is real, but they're not getting rid of what any of that knowledge is. They're taking it and then they're adding what they know now. So it's within these contexts that we start to really see ideas of gender kind of build up within the medieval period. And so what we need to understand when we talk about all the rest of this is that's how these ideas get made, right? You have this interesting kind of stew and amalgamation of philosophy, both Christian and ancient, in order to kind of like assert that these are the ideals and that things have kind of always been thus. Medieval people don't have a desire to build something new. They have a desire to build on an extant base. So it's a really different way of thinking about knowledge. And the idea here is that knowledge is cumulative and we're always getting more all of the time, right? Okay. Which brings us on to our next subject, which is kind of looking at medieval beauty ideals. So I'm kind of like doing this talk in the way it's following the chapters of my book. So, come with me on a journey. Here, so we know that women, like from a philosophical standpoint, are a particular way. But we see that in the medieval period, the way that beauty is thought about kind of like really changes and is quite interesting. So at the beginning of the medieval period, you have people you'll see argue about the idea that, well, like beauty, it just is what it is, right? If you find like quite old medieval texts, if they talk about women and they talk about the way that women look, they'll say she was very beautiful. The end, right? Like that, and that's what they'll say about her. And you're going, oh, okay, great. Like I'll take your word for it. She was very beautiful, right? And oftentimes here, one of the reasons that they say that is there's this idea within the medieval period that beauty is natural, right? And that beauty is therefore kind of bestowed on people by God. So there's this kind of like beauty as a way of saying that you are blessed and favored by God. And that's why you look very, very nice, apparently. But they don't really say what that has to do with. And there is kind of a reason for that. And it's because, well, you know, beauty should be subjective, right? It should be like something that we all think different things about things. But also part of it is because, you know, ancient people didn't really talk about it either. Same thing. If you go and you read, you know, the Aeneid, or if you read, you know, the Odyssey, they'll talk about how people are pretty, but they don't really say very much about what ways they are pretty. And one of the oldest things that medieval people can get a hold of in order to kind of decide who should be beautiful and what beauty should be considered, because obviously you've got to go ask an ancient person about that. You can't just decide what beauty is. There's got to be some ancient reason for it. Is they find this guy, Maximianus, who is working in the 6th century. And he more particularly is talking about Helen of Troy. All right, and now that is really good and exciting because Helen of Troy, that's a mythological figure. Oh, that's ancient, so this is really, really good. And what he says about her is that she has golden hair and a downcast milky neck. So blonde hair, white skin, long neck. Fantastic, like really exciting stuff, right? Medieval people kind of look at this and they say, all right, well, that's fine, but I would like to expand on it. And particularly from the 11th century onward, 12th century onward, when we have the rise of universities, we also have this rise of people who are then kind of like writing about what an idealized woman would be, wanting to kind of create a template. You know, like wanting to create kind of something in the same way that we think about philosophy, what's the ideal woman? And so we get here that the ideal woman for Maximianus has ingenious features to make more of her face, black eyebrows, so you gotta have blonde hair but black eyebrows, a free forehead, which means kind of like large. What they're really looking for is like a hairline that kind of starts really far up your head. This is a really big thing for them. Bright skin. Maximianus says, these notes are burned in my mind. I love the flames and little swollen lips which tasted me full of kisses. Okay, so not a whole ton. Blonde hair, long white neck, black eyebrows, big forehead, and you know, little like pouty lips, right? But interestingly, the free forehead does mean something here, because sometimes when we find some older kind of ancient texts, if they do talk about things, for example, they will say that beautiful women in the past have a unibrow. And so like the Greeks are kind of like, ooh, unibrow, we really, really like that. And medieval people are like, no, we're not going in on the unibrow. So there will be much is made about like the free forehead and the eyebrows. So you don't want a unibrow according to Western Christianity. Which brings us to Matthew Vendôme and Geoffrey of Vinsauf. So these guys are writing in the 12th century. And Matthew Vendôme writes in his Ars Versificatoria about how you should describe a beautiful woman. And the Ars Versificatoria is like the art of the verse maker. So like, here's how you write a poem, right? So it's like a how-to book about what you should do. And he explicitly says, this is how you should describe a beautiful woman. Like, not that there's any kind of different beautiful woman, then they could mean all sorts of different things. He's like, no, this is how you do it. And there's only kind of one. So the hair is blonde. You have a white and clear space between the eyebrows, with the separated arches that do not allow the hairs to run rampant. So no monobrow underlined. Your face and eyes should be bright like a shining star. There should be a red and snowy white countenance, which means kind of white skin but blushing cheeks, essentially. This then oftentimes gets related as being like snow and roses. Like over and over and over again, you will see these people say like snow and roses. It's very boring, but they will go for it. And then sometimes I'll be like, well, the nose is neither too big nor too small, so you can do with that what you will. That's fine. And you have a mouth small, teeth like ivory, lips swollen, honeyed with breath like a rose that pants for kisses. So, which is quite interesting because, you know, here we're supposed to understand, right, that being lusty or being sexual is wrong, and that's something that women do. But also that is kind of like part of the standard of beauty, right? Like it's having this sort of mouth that does want to kiss people, right? And he's kind of like participating in this. So we get that one. And then they start moving on to body shape. So that's like the face. And what they tend to do is they create what we call a literary portrait that always kind of follows the same pattern. So it starts sort of at the head and then moves downward. So, you know, they talk about how the hair is blonde, the forehead is free and clear, the eyebrows look like this, the nose is neither too big nor too small. Then you get to the mouth. They're really into necks. And they want you to have a neck long and white like a column or a swan. Those are your two options. So sometimes it's kind of like making this allusion to sort of like classical beauty in like the real sense, like you've got a neck like a temple girl, I guess, or you know, a swan being a little bit more poetic. Occasionally we see within Muslim poetry, they will say a neck like a heron instead, which I've read so many of these at this point that I get really excited when someone mentions bird other than a swan, so that's good. They then move on to the shoulders, which need to be white and smooth. And then down to the dainty breasts, which should be a brief handful. They're very specific about this. Those breasts better be dainty or small. Sometimes we will see people say that someone has breasts which are quote unquote small enough, which kind of seems like a little bit negative. But they're very insistent that the breast should be small. But then they want sides that narrow in at the waist with a luscious little belly. So for them, the ideal woman has pot belly, which is what we can kind of see here. You then get a desire for fleshy, well-shaped thighs, and like the legs and feet. You know, it really all depends. Sometimes, occasionally, you get a foot guy in there who like really goes and he talks about how feet should be small and dainty. But most people say like, well, yeah, she sure had feet, you know, something like that. Legs, sometimes they will say that they like them long, but they don't particularly care. So all of which is to say, so here we have, this is a picture of Pygmalion in his statue. And when you see pictures of beautiful women in the medieval period, they then look like this. And they all look like this. Every single one of them is blonde, and you know she's got. Do we see the high forehead here? These really arched eyebrows, tiny little breasts. You know, your pot belly. So what they're looking at as the ideal human figure here is a pear shape, essentially, and that's what they want it to be. And it's absolutely imperative that their skin is white. Like that is one of the most important things that you can possibly have. And it becomes rigid, right? To the point where it's almost like you can find images like this. So this is from the Ghent Altarpiece by Jan van Eyck, and these are the Virgin Martyr saints. And if they were not holding the things like their attributes, they would all be exactly the same woman. Right, so you can tell that St. Agnes, they're holding her lamb. That's how you know it's St. Agnes. It's St. Barbara, they're holding her tower. That's how you know it's St. Barbara. But they're all completely interchangeable, right? Because they're all holy, so therefore they're all beautiful. And if you are beautiful, then you look like exactly one thing. And that one thing is this blonde woman with a pear shape and white skin. Later in the medieval period, they will kind of start to sometimes talk about eye color, and they prefer gray eyes. Like they're specifically looking for gray eyes. I don't know why, but that's what they're going for. Not blue, not green, gray, which is very interesting. But the thing that we need to kind of like meditate on this is you have this kind of creation of a beauty ideal, which is ossified and says that there's exactly one way to be beautiful. But it also favors specifically rich women, right? So if 80% of all women are peasants and they are out there mowing hay, you know, in all weathers, they do not have white skin. Right, this is a world before SPF, right? So, you know, you will often have a tan or something like that. And that's going to be impossible for poorer women. White skin is something that is for women who are indoors. And they live an indoor lifestyle, and they don't need to go thresh at any point in time. Small breasts as well. This is an indicator of wealth because what happens there is that rich women have wet nurses. Right. So when you give birth to your child, what happens then is you immediately kind of like bind your breasts up, and then you give your kid away to somebody else who nurses them. Interestingly, guides about how to pick a wet nurse will say that you should pick a wet nurse who looks like an idealized beauty. It's like the same thing. They'll be like, oh, she should have a complexion of snow and roses, and she should this, that, and the other than the breasts being small, right? But there's this idea that these looks kind of come through the breast milk, and that's how children are nourished. So women who have children will have a kind of edge on women who are poorer if they can give them away in keeping this particular beauty attribute, right? And I mean, I'm sure that there's a lot of people who would be very excited to not be the one who's waking up at 3 a.m. to feed the infant, right? So rich people in the medieval period, that's what they have going for them. Same thing with bellies and round thighs. Bellies and round thighs, that means there's food in the house. You know, fantastic, right? So A, you're eating very well. Right, you're eating very well indeed if you sport a belly and nice thick thighs. And again, it probably means that you're not doing manual labor, right? Like you're not out doing kind of back-breaking work all the time. Those girls are probably a bit thinner and probably a bit more well-muscled, right? Here we see then this kind of like idea of femininity and idealized beauty being linked to idleness, and, you know, class more specifically. So it's much easier for a rich woman to be a beauty than it is for a poor woman, right? Because there's just too many odds against you. So, you know, they act as though it's natural. The way that they speak about these things is that it's natural, it's holy, and it's not. It's classed, right? But it's also completely ossified, and there's nothing that you can do about it. You will see these women across the medieval period. This is what it means to be beautiful for hundreds upon hundreds of years, which is quite interesting. So moving on, then we'll talk about more specifically about sexuality. Then, so this is then the third chapter of the book. So we understand now where these ideas come from, what the expectations are about women and beauty, but there is also this idea about women and sexuality that, you know, Augustine, as we said, puts thusly, which says that human nature then is without any doubt ashamed about lust, and rightly ashamed. For in its disobedience, which subjected the sexual organs solely to its own impulses and snatched them from the will's authority, we see a proof of the retribution imposed on man for that first disobedience. And it was entirely fitting that this resolution should show itself in the part which affect the procreation of the very nature that was charged for the worst through the first great sin. Right? So here he is talking about it again. He's very upset about sexuality, and part of, you know, what he says is the great shame that Adam and Eve feel when they are cast out of the Garden of Eden and they realize that they're naked is that they are turned on by the fact that they are naked. Whereas before they were just walking around being naked, and it was just sort of neither here nor there. So the lust that kind of like stirs them then also acts upon their organs, and they have no control over it. And for Augustine, this is a great and terrible thing. So he writes very, very often about, you know, the shame of the fact that genitive organs are uncontrollable. And so the thing to kind of understand here is that within the bringing of lust into the world, then we have irrationality. Because it's irrational. It's irrational to be lustful all the time. It would be rational to, you know, simply have children and kind of like shake hands and walk away, right? That this is the ideal way that things would be. It's women's fault that this irrationality has entered the world. And there is very, very kind of little way around it. So, you know, as we can see kind of things proceeding in this particular picture, with Eve being taken out of Adam's side there. You'll notice that Eve is the ideal beauty, with white skin, small breasts, a pot belly, blonde hair, you know. Yeah, so she always has. But, you know, it's basically her actions which lead to the kind of downfall of mankind. And therefore, it's kind of like Eve's actions that bring sexuality into the world, which means by their very nature, women are the lustful ones. right? So for Plato, it's women are the lustful ones because it's their actions in the world that have, their being in the world at all whatsoever is what makes lust exist. For Christians, women are the lustful ones because they're the ones who did the fall of man, right? So it's Eve's fault. So she's the first one who bit into the apple. So she was the first one who ever got horny, right? So, and that's kind of how it works. So women are kind of like inextricably bound up with this conception of sexuality. And in particular, we see this in things like, for example, Chaucer's Wife of Bath, who has this great thing in her preamble. The Wife of Bath's preamble to her story, much longer than her actual story, and also much more fun, in my opinion. But she says, talking about all the husbands she's had, "Blessed be God that I have wedded 5, of which I have picked out the best, both for their nether purse and of their strong box. Diverse schools make perfect clerks, and diverse practices in many various works makes the workman truly perfect. Of 5 husbands schooling am I, welcome the 6th whenever he shall appear, for truly I will not keep myself chaste in all." And this is meant to be kind of like the average woman, right? And we see this over and over again, this kind of distrust of women, because it's said that they are marrying because they really want access to sex. And sure, it's acceptable to get married and have sex. That's the only time it's acceptable, is when you get married and then you're having procreative sex. But it's said repeatedly by most philosophers, including Augustine, including Jerome, and including medieval philosophers such as, for example, Thomas Aquinas, that if you enjoy the sex too much or you're having too much sex, even within a married context, that's bad. Right? So when you have sex with your husband or wife in the medieval period, ideally you kind of get in and get out as fast as possible, and you have the least amount of fun possible. You shouldn't be indulging in stuff like making out. You should probably like really try to keep any sort of like what we would call foreplay to a minimum. It's just supposed to be about having children and moving out. But women don't believe in that. Women are really interested in sex, and that's why women get married, and that's why you have women like the Wife of Bath, who's been married 5 times. And this is kind of an allusion to the fact that she must be particularly lustful, because for Christians, the idea is that, ideally, you just get married the one time. You can remarry if your husband dies. It's like within the realm of possibility, but especially if you have children, you ought not. You kind of like had your one, that was your chance to have sex, but the way that the actual world works isn't that same kind of way of thinking about things. The families themselves are constantly always in disagreement with the church because they want more heirs. They want things to kind of be passed on. There, you can use marriage for all kinds of useful ways of moving around property and stuff like that. So it never comes down to it that remarriage stops, but it's always slightly suspect, right? Which is what you see here from the Wife of Bath. And she'll just openly say, she married her husbands because they were good in bed and they were rich, right? So, and fair enough, ma'am. So if you got to have sort of something, but, the idea here is not because they were good men, not because they were good Christians who would be a good father, nothing like that. She said, well, I wanted to have sex with them. And so you're supposed to understand that this is deep down what most women are like. All of which leads to images like this. So this is quite a famous image that it comes from one of the BNF versions of the Roman de la Rose. So women's sexuality that is seen as being particularly insatiable. Women are seen in this way as being irrational and unholy, and they're also more particularly interested in the wrong kinds of sex as a result of that. So women's lust, as is kind of like written about at this time, is seen as being irrational because it doesn't stop at the right time. So it said that men's sexuality, when you have sex after orgasm, and now for medieval people, orgasm is seen on the part of both women and men as necessary for procreation, because it's thought that women have semen and so do men. And then it kind of like mixes up together, and bada bing, bada boom, that's a baby, right? So that's kind of where, and this is also the classical idea as well. Aristotle doesn't think so. Aristotle thinks that it's just semen and women are kind of like ground that you put seeds in, and that they don't introduce anything at all. But most people don't come on that with Aristotle. So the trouble is that women then will still kind of be interested in sex after that happens. It is noted. And so they're like, oh, these women, they are completely insatiable. And this is likened to, by some philosophers, as wet wood. So it takes a longer time for wet wood to start on fire, but then it burns hotter when it does. So women's lust will be referred to as being a forest fire, in this kind of like all-encompassing, like a unstoppable kind of force of nature. And then there's also this worry about women because they're interested in all these kinds of sex that are not procreative. So in the medieval period, any form of sex which cannot lead to procreation, that's what sodomy is. So women seem to be too interested in doing all these other things other than the specific thing that you're supposed to do in order to have children. And so that is suspect as well. And this is how you get images like this, where this is like a nun. So the idea is that like all women at all times are kind of on the prowl looking for sex, and they're out there doing this. But it's because of their irrationality, of the fact that they are kind of lesser humans because they were made second, and because of original sin. That's how you get women to be like the wife of Bat. So this is all a kind of really interesting thing to kind of think about, because it doesn't bear a whole lot of relation to the way that we talk about women now and sexuality. Our understanding of women and sexuality is pretty much the opposite of that in a lot of cases. So just keep that in mind for when we get to the end. But the last thing we're going to talk about right now is women in work in the medieval period, because this is something that doesn't get talked about very, very often. And it's strange because women are working at all levels of society for the great majority of human history. You name it, women are there doing it. The modern idea that women are now entering the workforce, you'll hear that one, is very silly, because women only ever left the workforce in about the 19th century. And within that, more specifically, only one group of women really left the workforce, and that was middle-class women. Working class women, the hint's in the name, they were working the whole time. You know, like you go into any mill in Manchester and you'll see that there were quite a lot of women working the entire time. And indeed, upper class women and high class women were doing work the entire time, whether that's with charitable organizations or working in government. You know, we must understand that the wives of politicians, for example, are engaged in work, or, queens, duchesses, things like that. That is a form of diplomacy, and it's a form of work. Of course, within this, we also have to mention that housework is work. That housework is work because we all hate it. And if we ever make a bit of money, one of the first things that we do is we get a housekeeper, right? We're like, I do not want to, everyone's trying to get out doing their own laundry, right? So, this is the sort of thing that kind of reminds you of the fact that it is work, but we just kind of assume that, that isn't something that's worth talking about, right? But one of the things that we have trouble with in terms of finding working women in the medieval period is what you call coverture. And coverture is, the practice of taking your husband's name. So oftentimes we'll see sort of records of people who are working, and it'll say, like Henry Fowler and wife. It's like the and wife in there. Or, you'll see Mrs. whomever, right? And you don't get to have an actual name of people. And oftentimes it's just sort of like assumed for medieval people that women are working, and it's just not worth mentioning because it's just that, it's the air they breathe. It's like, of course, there's women there. Women are working everywhere. Why is that worth mentioning? But then because of how we have sort of thought about work in the kind of post-19th century context, we go back and go, oh, looks like there aren't any women working because of how we see society, right? So that's kind of on us. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the work that gets done. And you got to start sort of with peasant women, right, who are doing it all, God bless them. Here in this image, you see women doing laundry, which is one of the most incredibly labor-intensive things that you can do in the, even up until the modern period, before the advent of the washing machine. It was really kind of horrible. So what you do is you take all of your laundry, you layer it with ashes and eggshells in soapy water, and then you put like boiling water over the top of that. And then that's a process which will take multiple days where you keep heating water and pouring it on top of it. And then you eventually go and take it down to a water source where it's rinsed. Now that might be in a river, it might be in a spring, it might be in a dedicated washing house. And that's where you kind of rinse everything out and then you put it out on the fields or on bushes or something like that to dry. It's often a communal activity because it's incredibly heavy to carry wet laundry around like that. So people will kind of be helping to wring things out and move things along like that. Peasant women are, of course, also involved in every form of farm work. Like you name it, women are doing it as well. Now, there are some forms that might be more particularly led by men, but it's not exclusive. So plowing in particular, we see that might be that men do it more often, but especially if you have a smaller family or you're just starting out, oftentimes if it's just kind of like a man and his wife and they don't have children yet, it will be the two of them plowing in a field. Every single other chore on the farm is pretty much shared. So it doesn't, if it doesn't matter if you're picking or planting or reaving or whatever it is, women do it all. But then there are also these things like the laundry that get done more specifically by women, and one of the big ones there is brewing. So it's not true that medieval people drank beer all the time because you couldn't drink the water. That's just a myth. I mean, that's kind of true about cities, but not really. They drink a lot of beer because they like it. And also for them, it kind of acts as an energy drink. Like, again, if you were kind of like working in the field all day, having a drink that's got a bunch of calories in it is a really nice thing for you, right? So they're drinking small beer, they're not drunk. They get drunk after work like everybody does, but you're making your own ale all of the time, and because ale goes off really quickly, you need to be doing it all the time. So women oftentimes do that. Baking, of course, is also an ongoing thing that is happening for peasant women. You got to have your bread every day, so that is happening. And that is also kind of like part and parcel with cooking more generally, right? So there's always kind of like this constant background thing of cooking going on. But they're also involved in cloth production more generally. So medieval people oftentimes like they're doing it all kind of like from the field to putting it on your clothes. So it's like, they make their own linen, they grow their own flax, they turn that into thread, they make that into linen. You shear your sheep, you make the wool, you weave things. Rich people can buy cloth. And it's certainly something that if you've got a lot of money, which some peasants do, not all peasants are poor, then you might be able to afford to buy in cloth. But otherwise, it's more particularly peasant women who are doing that kind of weaving. So, all of the work of being on a farm, but plus like all this other stuff that we don't even think of anymore because we can go to M&S and, buy a jumper, right? They can't do that. So, so peasant women are involved in all of these things. Then you get to women of kind of like the middling sort. And these are the sorts of women who are kind of involved more particularly in business, and it's often urban, right? So it's like by the time that you've got kind of middling people around now, there are middling peasants again, as I say. Often a big way that you make money is by making surplus things like surplus ale and then selling it at market. Or maybe you sell like extra eggs or something like that, this sort of thing. But in cities, the big things that you have women involved in are running stalls. So like market stalls here in London, you've got the big market at Smithfield, you've got the markets kind of over near all the city walls. There's like markets all over town. And women are often the ones who are running those things. Often what they're selling there sometimes is just food because a lot of times in cities people don't have their own kitchens because kitchens burn things down. So if you can get out of like not having an oven, then a lot of times people do. So you have people selling bread is a really common one. Selling eggs, things like that. But also in the same way that we have food markets, they have food markets. So you might just like stop by to get dinner. One up from that is shopkeepers. And the shopkeepers, really interestingly, tend to be more women than men, is what we tend to see in records. Men keep a lot of shops as well, but a lot of the time, it's kind of like a 60-40 sort of deal. So women who get a little bit of money often run sort of all-purpose shops where they'll sell a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And we have lots of records that showing that this is like a specifically kind of seen as being a feminine thing to do is run a shop. And that's because a lot of women are responsible for bookkeeping, specifically. So the people who are kind of looking at the books in any given business are the women, and they are kind of looking after oftentimes whatever their husband's business is. And now you say that you are raised in London, and if your father is in a guild, you will have been brought up learning that trade in the same way that, you know, your brothers would. Now, granted, you're probably not going to be able to join the guild. There's some exceptions to this. If you marry someone else who is in the guild and they die, then you can take that place in the guild unless you remarry. So there are women in guilds and stuff like that. It's just harder to get in. But it is assumed that the people who are doing that business, the ones that are keeping all the records, are women, and it is a specifically kind of like feminized sort of thing. So by the time that women are keeping books for their husband, they might also just like have a shop that they keep, right? Because there's this particularly feminine way of looking at things. And that's kind of like what the catch-all of helpmeets are. So it's like basically, you know, the whole behind every great man is a woman. It's like, yeah, that's very true, right? It's like it is pretty much, there's always women kind of involved in all of these same all of the same things that we expect to see men in. So leather work, or if you're a grocer, or if you are a fishmonger, women are involved in all stages of that as well, and they're expected to be. And as a result of that, we often see, for example, people from guilds will marry other people within guilds, because it's like you want a daughter who's brought up in the trade, who's going to kind of be a good wife and can help you right away. More particularly, though, some of the only guilds that are women-centered are the silk guilds. So here in London, we have silk guilds. There's silk guilds in Paris. For whatever reason, that's feminine. That's a feminine trade, right? But you will see over and over again that if a trade becomes particularly lucrative, suddenly men come in and take it over. Right. So if it's going like, so embroidery is a good example of this. So like high quality embroidery is often thought as like a feminine skill until everyone realizes that you make a lot of money doing embroidery, and then suddenly men are in there embroidering, right? So you have to, there's this kind of like fine balance there, right? And then there's of course the nobility and royalty, and they're involved in diplomatic work. Right. So they will be oftentimes the people who kind of go back and forth running messages. The reason you get yourself a foreign queen is because it means that, you know, you're going to have this kind of reciprocity between her father's court and yours. The same thing goes with noble households. They intermarry all the time, and they are doing a really high level of diplomatic work at all times. They're also running their households, and their households are like businesses, essentially. So like a castle full of people, it's the women who are looking after that, and they need to keep account of what everybody's eating, what are the ingoings and outgoings. They're oftentimes responsible for buying like arms and armory for, you know, the guards, things like this. So it is actually women within these circumstances that are keeping, you know, the guys who they've got to run here, there, and everywhere. Like a woman is going to be less likely to be on horseback going down the road delivering a message, but she's going to be the one that's keeping the fort at home, literally, you know, because it's a fort. And so they're the ones that kind of keep things ticking over. And as part of that, you need to also understand how to manage peasants. You need to understand like what the vineyards are supposed to be producing, you know, in terms of wine. You need to understand how much wheat is going to be coming in. So they're really high level, complex ways of looking at work. All of us, which brings us to the question, why have I brought you here to yell at you about this today? Other than, you know, because I wrote a book about it. The reason that thinking about these things matters is because a lot of the times when we look at the way that our society is organized and the way that we kind of treat women and the way that women are gendered, is that we always say that things have always been this way. Right? There's this idea about tradition dictating particular things. So still, you will see people say, well, traditionally, women stayed home, you know, and didn't work. You know, you'll see things like, you'll see ridiculous people like evolutionary psychologists who will say, like, well, we've all always thought that hourglass figures are the sexiest thing, and that's what we're looking for. No. That's not what medieval people think. You know, we will say that, you know, women are not interested in sex at all, and the reason that women have sex is to get into a relationship, and then they kind of put up with it, whereas like men are sort of like looking for sex all the time. So obviously none of that's true. None of that's true. These things are changing constantly. They change all of the time. So the medieval way of looking at a beautiful woman is no longer true at all whatsoever. The medieval way of considering that women's sexuality no longer seen as being true. And indeed, medieval women are just kind of like out in their workforce doing their thing the entire time. So the point is that we change the maths behind why it is that women aren't as good as men all the time, but we keep the answer, which is that, well, women aren't very good, right? And this kind of changes over and over again. And if we decide that we like something more, or we're more comfortable with something, that will suddenly become a male attribute, right? If like, just in the same way that a trade becomes very lucrative and suddenly it's a male trade, like that. Now that in the kind of post-sexual revolution, sex is kind of seen as maybe a good thing, suddenly men really like it and women don't, right? So you see these things that are changing all the time. So the point of it is, it's good for us to sit down and have a look at gendered expectations and gender roles, because we can realize we're just making it up. And if which is to say they're a social construct. And when I say that something is a social construct, I don't mean that it's not real. It is real because we've kind of spoken it into existence, right? And we've spoken it into existence on like a long kind of storied tradition. But the point is, if something is a social construct, we can deconstruct it, and we can choose to stop doing it at any time we want. But it helps us to do that if we really look into the history and we kind of see what expectations of women have been over time. Which brings us to questions.
Well, we've had loads of questions. And I don't think we've ever had so many. And I don't think we've ever had a speaker speak for so long.
Sorry, everybody. Yeah.
I will ask some questions that have been in the chat. But before I do that, is anyone in the room would like to ask a question? Yes. Oh.
So you first. So all the list of things that made medieval women attractive. The only one that didn't make sense to me was the pot belly. So what's the logic? I say not that they are, but what's the reasoning behind that?
It's really interesting because they never say why it's sexy, but they're just like, oh, that's what's sexy, everybody, right? And the only thing that I can kind of really come up with it is the sign of luxury. Right, like having, this sort of like ample flesh on your body is, luxurious. It means that like you're eating well. It means all these things, but they never break it down. They just say that this is the way that things are, right? It is just true that blondes are hotter. It's just true that you want a pot belly. And so it's quite funny because they just sort of speak it into the world as a poetic conceit at first. And then they say, well, that's the way that things have always been, right? And so I find that really useful because it's just sort of like they just make up their mind one day and they're like, well, that's how things are. And, but we kind of do that as well. We're just sort of also saying, well, that's just the way things are, even though we don't agree with them on that at all whatsoever. But the pot belly is big, like to the point where oftentimes if I'm kind of showing pictures of medieval women in public, people are like, why are they pregnant? And I'm like, they're not pregnant. They're beautiful. And then that's just kind of like the way things are. So yes. Oh yeah, so this is a really interesting one in the chat. Oh wait, no, how are we going to do questions?
Well, if we just we let the gentleman in the room.
Oh yeah, sorry. Oh, there was more. I didn't even see. I'm sorry.
I'll read out the ones.
Yeah, I'm too hyped. Go for it.
Kind of a basic question, but this is such a massive topic. How did you approach kind of getting into it for the book, and how you were going to structure?
Yeah, it was a really tricky one. So I knew that I had to get into it by talking about like kind of the classical epistemology within this. Like you couldn't get out of it without doing that, in kind of like showing the work of how you get to these ideas. And then what I kind of decided was I knew for a fact that I definitely wanted to write about work because I think it's really interesting, and people just don't for whatever reason. And I knew I was going to write about sexuality because it's one of my specialities. And so I was like, well, that'll be easy. And the reason that I ended up writing about beauty standards within that as well is because when I was doing the other things, just over and over again, they would keep talking about how important it was for women to be beautiful, or the way that they would talk about women when I'd be looking up, for example, queens in the early medieval period. You would see that women who had initially been enslaved, and then they ended up becoming queen, and they would go on and on about how these women are beautiful. It's early, so they don't say how they're beautiful. And I kind of realized that it's that beauty is what they're using to explain why they should be allowed to be queen. Right, it's the idea of that inherent thing about them being naturally beautiful or like blessed by God. And it's like, oh well, then it's a sort of like divine right, but specifically for women. So I thought it's worth talking about because it's always kind of, it's this ongoing thing with women where it's like women have to be all the things that men are, but also hot. Right. And that's something that's still like we're kind of dealing with, is just this expectation of living up to these kind of like beauty standards. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of traverse them and kind of really look at them, because medieval people are very explicit about it. Now we kind of are like, oh, well, it's neither here nor there. Well, isn't it nice if women are pretty? Medieval people are like, that means God likes you. And so it's quite funny there. And so I thought it was worth kind of like looking into that. And also in the book more particularly, I also get into the fact that, and then also for both medieval people and now, a big part of that too is with the naturalness, you're also not allowed to interfere. Like, you're not supposed to do anything to be beautiful. You're just supposed to be beautiful. And if you pluck your eyebrows, you're going to hell. Which is like literally something they will say. They're like, there's these things about women who pluck their eyebrows being in hell, having their foreheads gnawed by demons. So on the one hand, they're being told constantly, you can't be beautiful unless you can't be beautiful and have a monobrow. Absolutely don't do that. And by the way, being beautiful means that you're holy and God loves you, but don't you dare try to live up to that. And so I really liked that kind of the dichotomy there of this expectation that's laid at the foot of women, but also the expectation that you never do anything to encourage it.
Okay, Graham's asked about 3 really great questions. I don't know, Graham, if you want to unmute yourself and ask Eleanor direct, but the one that immediately I thought was interesting was, do you have any insights into the attitudes of women's notions of beauty outside Western Europe?
Yeah, so they kind of differ quite interestingly. In Islamic Spain, interestingly, they're quite similar. Where you'll still kind of see this preference for blondes and things like that. In the Byzantine Empire, interestingly, they still love a monobrow. And the Byzantines are like, monobrows, we love monobrows, and they talk about that all the time. And indeed, also the Byzantines really like curly dark hair. So they talk about that very differently. And also, oftentimes you see within an Islamic context, you do still see this kind of preference for smaller breasts and things like that. But within the Islamic context, things are also kind of like a little bit more overtly sexual at times. So they will talk about the ways that they like pubic hair to be and that sort of thing. And also, interestingly, you do see the same kind of prohibitions in the Islamic world about like worrying about women being too interested in their beauty, but whereas medieval Europeans tend to talk more about like don't wear makeup, medieval Muslims are often saying don't perfume yourself too much. And it's kind of like there's this thing about perfume in particular being a real kind of worry there. So interestingly, you'll see Islamic people in Spain, they're just going in with all the rest of their periods. They're like, yeah, blondes, woo, and this sort of thing. But if you are looking kind of like in the African littoral, or if you're looking over in Asia Minor, then brown hair comes in. But you still do see people like bellies and people like little breasts. Don't know why.
So again, on the beauty idea,
Mm-hmm.
how influential were the Roman and Greek statues? And was there an understanding that the marble they were actually originally painted?
Yeah, so because medieval people, when they come into contact with Greek and Roman statues, they probably still were painted to an extent, right? So it's been another 1,000 years or so of like the process of all those things being stripped away. And indeed, sometimes we stripped the paint away ourselves, like thanks Victorians, nice job, right? And medieval people do the same thing where they're always painting their own statues. So they do see these things and they really enjoy them and they write about them a lot, to the point where we have, for example, Protestants writing, and you have to be careful with Protestants when they're writing these things because they're doing it to make fun of Catholics. But they will say that they find these statues that are around very sexy. So when you go into church and you see a statue of Mary, they're like, oh, and she's so sexy because she's again living up to these ideals. She's gonna have the pear shape, she's gonna have a little bit, all of these things. And they'll say, and it was very distracting and I couldn't keep my mind on God, right? So they see themselves as kind of like in a tradition with like the Roman and Greek statues, which they certainly see. And when you look at Roman and Greek statues. They're not exactly the same as medieval ones because it's not quite so exaggerated, but you do see more of an emphasis on having a bit of a belly. They seem to kind of like that, you know, having fairly thick thighs and things of that nature. So it's clear that they don't really have, like if you go to the British Museum, you know, right when you kind of like come in, there's this really great picture, a statue of Aphrodite at her bath, and she's kind of like crouching over. And when I go look at her, I'm like, well, yeah, she looks like what the medieval beauties are sort of supposed to be. So, and oftentimes with those, you would see like Aphrodite in particular pictured as a blonde, right? So there is some overlap there where you do kind of have these same beauty standards that come through.
I'm conscious of how much longer.
I'm happy to stay another 15 or so. Yeah, sorry.
Don't say that.
Yeah, so.
But okay, so.
It's my fault. I'm the one who talked to you.
I'll move on because there was a lot of discussion in the chat about peasants.
Peasants.
In particular, so you mentioned about not all peasants were poor.
Yeah, that's right.
So what was the how would you be a well-off peasant but not middle?
Yeah, okay, so this is interesting. And so Zvi Rosby, one of my colleagues, wrote a really great breakdown where he did, he studied the peasant community in Hailstone here in England and looked at what their incomings and outgoings were. So, you know, he was looking at taxation records in order to see what they were bringing in and out. And so you can have incredibly wealthy peasants, which we'll see. So what the breakdown is that about 50% of them, yeah, they seem kind of poor. So, which is to say, 40% of the European population, right? And then of that remaining group, we see about 25% are about middle class and 25% are rich. So that's about kind of like 20% of the European population and 20% of the European population, respectively, right? And indeed, this is where the term gentry comes from. So the gentry are very wealthy peasants who are not members of the nobility, right? And these are people who can be so wealthy that they might even have like you know, a retinue of armed guards. They might even they might be like protecting their land in this way. And it's possible to kind of like buy up more land. You know, that you don't necessarily own it. The medieval ownership system is complex. You probably still have a landlord that you would have to pay tax to, but you can kind of progressively bring more and more land together. And so there are some incredibly wealthy peasants. You do also see then, of course, kind of like middle class ones, and these are going to be the ones, you know, both the wealthy ones and middle class ones are going to be people who also have kind of like cottage industry things going on. So maybe they make more cloth.
And Black Death helps, doesn't it?
And the Black Death does help as well. So when people start dying off, then obviously we see a bit of a jump because you can start asking for more money. And also there's more land going because a lot of people died. So you can just kind of like scoop up their land because no one else is going to work it. You can just say to your landlord, hey, this is mine now. And the landlord's like, yes, great, please. Like, I need the taxes, you know. So because they have such trouble getting anyone to pay tax at the time at all whatsoever. So, yeah.
The work women are doing, either in, how much of it is paid and how much is unpaid?
Yeah, this is a difficult one because a lot of it is unpaid because, you know, with peasant farming, you know, some of it is subsistence, obviously. But then there's usually some things that make more money. So again, like brewing is one of the big ones where you can make more money. Cloth production is one of the big ones that you can make more money. And if you can get enough animals or livestock together, you can make more money. A lot of the time, people will have a dairy, something like that, and that's particularly seen as women's work, like milking cows, things like that. And so making cheeses, that's a big way that people make more money. So essentially, it's if you can scale it up, if you've got enough money to get a few more cows, to get a few more of this, that, or the other thing, then you can kind of scale up. And then within that, we see, you know, these are certainly peasant women, they run a farm, but they'll have like maids and stuff. And then you hire other women and you go, okay, I'm going to get the neighbor's girl in to help with the milking. And so you kind of, then we'll see, you know, if someone's running a really large brewery, they have people come in. So you could see large scale operations at farms. And when you get larger scale operations, then that's stuff that's going to be sold on, and that's one of the big ways money gets made.
I think we could talk for hours. I don't know if you want to look in the chat and see if there's one last question that really reaches out.
Oh yeah, let's see.
Otherwise, we'll stop, and I can forward you the questions that we haven't had time to answer.
Yeah, let's see. Because I've kind of got some of these, so I'm going to scroll in. I guess I saw one about women in reading, and I'd like to talk about that because that's a really interesting one. Because the reason I picked this image for the last one here is one of the big jobs that women have are teachers. So this is a woman teacher teaching geometry to a bunch of little boys here. And women do know how to read and write, but it's less common than men. But one of the reasons that this is the way that people are really thought of as being literate in the medieval period is reading and writing Latin. And interestingly, a lot of women can read their own vernacular language, which is, again, what you'd use for bookkeeping and things like that. But a lot of times maybe they don't know Latin, but they might know French, or they might know English, or they might know German, and then they write in those things. But then even interestingly, as I've just said with writing, oftentimes literacy and writing are divorced from each other. So we'll see, for example, really high up women who are like countesses and things, like their mom has kind of like sent them a letter at court and they're like, I can't write, mom. And, so they've got a scribe that does the actual writing, but they can read. So you might dictate that out. But we know that a lot of women can read, and often a lot of times women are responsible for teaching their own children in their own homes initial stuff. So stuff like ABCs, moms are doing that. And we know this also because of things like what we call books of hours. So they're like kind of private devotional prayer books. A lot of the times they'll have like lots of the prayers that you would say throughout the day. And then in the back, they also have, and here's how to teach your kids to read, so there will be like an alphabet to teach your kids and go through things like that. So a lot of people do have really basic kind of literacy and reading skills. It is more likely if you're well-to-do. So if you're a well-to-do peasant and you're going to need to read and write in order to keep books, more likely that you can, more likely that someone in a city can read and write than somebody in the countryside. And so it is all really classed, but, also just the concept of literacy is really, really different. But we do definitely see that it is something that women have and do, and something that if they are from the classes where reading and writing is expected, then they are the first people who do teach it.
I think on that, Eleanor, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I just kept going.
We just have to switch off the recording, and then thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks for coming.
Please come again to one of our talks.
But that was really interesting. Thank you.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Thanks for coming.